Hi, welcome to my video. Today I'm going to show you how to take apart a servo, disassemble the gear set, and re-grease it. We're going to be using a servo whose grease has dried out and become chalky and has made the servo difficult to move. In this case, we're talking about a Bluebird servo that I got from Hobby King. It's a 661 DMG-HS for high speed. So it's a high-speed metal gear servo. It's a little bit bigger than a standard size servo, but it's an excellent servo in my opinion, except for the fact that the grease dried out. And you can see from the accessory pack it comes with some really heavy-duty screws, and the control horns have metal rings around them to keep the control horn from breaking under extreme pressure. Okay, so let's get started. First thing you need to do is remove the 4 screws on the bottom of the servo. In this case, a 1.5 millimeter hex wrench does the trick. Now before you take it apart, here's a quick tip. Use some tape to hold the bottom portion of the servo together. All you want to do is remove the top cover. If you accidentally remove the bottom cover, the wire is going to come apart and there's an O-ring in there that's really tough to get back in there. Trust me. Okay, now you just simply lift the cover right off the top. And when you do, you'll see the gears inside. This is a high quality servo, and so it's going to have all metal gears, except for the first stage gear reduction, which is plastic. And I think that's done because that gear spins at a high speed. Okay, so now we can get a little better view of what's inside. The top cover has a ball bearing in it, and then 2 bushings that hold the rods that hold the gears. We're going to be oiling this bearing, but first let's take these gears apart. This next phase we're going to be taking the gears off and washing them with solvents, so I've put on some protective gloves. You can see the grease in some cases has gotten caked up and solidified. The first step is to take off this top metal gear. It just simply lifts up and out of place. Take it off and set it aside. Next we'll remove the gear on the right. It just lifts off, set it aside. And then we'll remove the main output shaft by lifting it straight up and off of the servo. Okay, and now you can see we only have 1 gear left. Now to get this gear out, you have to remove the shaft that it's on, and only once the shaft is removed can you take the gear out. And as you can see in this case, they both came out together. Set the gear aside, and now very carefully take off the O-ring. This particular servo has a very fine, fragile O-ring. And now we're going to clean the gears off. The solvent I like to use is called Ed's Red. You can look it up on the web. It's effectively 4 components in equal parts: acetone, light mineral spirits, kerosene, and automatic transmission fluid. I like to use Dexron 4. I don't think it really matters. The point is that this is a good mixture for dissolving away grease and rust, and it also, once it evaporates off, leaves a light film of mineral oil behind on the part. You also need a brush with some stiff bristles. I like to use a hobby brush that I've cut about half of the bristles off. Okay, so let's grab the first part, start cleaning it. Dip the brush in the solvent, and then just start brushing it off. It's kind of hard to work with these gloves, but what you're trying to do is just brush off all the grease. Now, every now and then you might drop one, so I keep a magnet on the back of my brush that just helps me pop it right back out again. So keep cleaning all the parts like this, and once you get most of the grease off, set it aside. Now, for the output shaft, try not to push any grease into the bearings, but you do want to get off all the old grease. Okay, now once the first cleaning has been completed, it's time to give it a nice good rinse with some fresh Ed's Red. So I have a bottle here. I just pop the parts in there and then give it a good shake for a minute, and they're going to come out looking brand new. Okay, and after a minute of shaking these off, I just open it back up, use my magnet to extract the parts, and set them out to drain. Try to remove as much of the solvent as you can with some paper towels. Okay, now before putting it back together, we gotta remove as much of the old grease as we can from the case. Cotton swabs and a clean tissue work great. Now before we start assembly, you need to make sure that the potentiometer in the servo is set at the halfway point. And in this case, you can see that it has like a flat surface to it. Just make sure that the flat surface is in line with the long axis of the servo. Of course, other manufacturers' servos might be different. Okay, the grease I'm going to be using is called Super Web Grease by Rock and Roll. You can buy this at most bicycle shops. I like this grease because it is very tacky and very stringy and really sticks to the gears well. Here's a top tip. You can get a hobby syringe, one without a needle, and you can load it with the grease of your choice, and then clip the end so that it comes out in just the size that you want. With this, I can put a tiny amount of grease right where I want it, which is perfect for this application. The most difficult gear to put in is the first one, because you have to put the gear in place and then put the shaft in. So I like to put the grease around the shaft and then pick up the gear, slide the gear into place, and then drop the shaft through the gear and into the case. And now we'll continue assembly with the output shaft. First, we'll put some light machine oil on the ball bearings, a couple of tiny drops distributed around the ring, and then we'll spin the bearing a few times to get the oil distributed. Notice how the output shaft has a slot in it that keys to the potentiometer. It only goes on one way. Now before we put the other gears on, we have to spread some grease on the output shafts because these shafts don't turn. Make sure you get the grease on both sides of the shaft and then turn the gears slightly as you place them on. Inserting the last gear locks everything together, from the motor through 4 stages of gear reduction to the output shaft. When going back together, a servo tester is handy because you can move the servo under its own power and make sure everything operates properly. Move the servo across its full range of operation a few times to make sure everything works fine. When adding the grease, you need to make sure you only grease where it's needed. The full range of motion on the output shaft is only 90 degrees, or 45 degrees in each direction, so that's the only portion of the gear that needs to be greased. And simply grease all the other gears by applying a light amount of grease on all the teeth. Don't forget to grease the bottom gear. It can be easy to miss. That's the one that turns the most. Put the servo back on the servo tester and run it through its full range of motion. Now, when putting it back together, the first thing that we have to do is lightly oil the ball bearing on the output shaft. Just apply a few small dabs of light machine oil to the ball bearing race, and then spin it a few times to distribute the oil. We should also put a little bit of oil on the center bushing and then on the outer bushing. This will help the reassembly go smoother. Before putting the top case on, we have to reinstall the O-ring. This O-ring helps seal the servo from dust and moisture. It's very fragile and therefore should be handled with care. The case on this servo has a ridge which can be used to hold the O-ring in place. The top cover goes on very easily. It just slides straight down and it should pop right into place. Once it's in place, tighten 2 opposite screws into the top cover. Then you can remove the tape that's holding the bottom section of the servo together. Replace all the screws, adjust the torque on the screws, and you're done. One last test with the servo tester will make sure everything is working properly. If you found this video useful, please give me a thumbs up. If not, leave a comment so we can make them better in the future. Thanks.